Colleagues, let's start our hearing.
Notre commission.
Our committee will be organising a public hearing today on the impact of Brexit on land transport. The purpose of the hearing is to give the opportunity to a series of high-level representatives from the road and rail transport sectors to make clear their position on Brexit, so as to enable us all to better understand the potential impact and to prepare for the risks which the UK leaving the European Union could have on their sectors. I'm sure you'll also be very interested to hear what major operators in those two sectors are preparing for changes arising from Brexit, and to better understand the implications of Brexit for the sector, and in particular for transport links between the UK and Ireland. We will also be very interested to hear what the different stakeholders in the sector hope that negotiators from the EU and the UK will be able to agree on. There will be two main sections in this hearing. First of all, we will listen to representatives from three main road transport operators. And the second part will be dealing with the rail sector, with representatives of that sector. Each panel will be followed by a question and answer session with our members. So I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our panellists this morning. And I would be grateful if each of you could give us a brief presentation. The first panel will be dealing with Brexit and road transport. It's my pleasure to have with me Verona Murphy. She's president of the Irish Road Haulage Association. Welcome, madam. It's also my honour to welcome Mr. James Hookham, Deputy CEO in the Freight Transport Association. Welcome, sir. And Mr. Daniel Kern, Senior Manager Trade Policy Affairs of the IRU. So, a warm welcome to all of you. As I said, we'll be starting with road transport. There are fairly simple ground rules. Each of you will have 7 minutes before moving on to a question and answer and debate section with the members. And then you'll have a chance to come back at the end. So, Ms. Murphy, I'd like to ask you to start. You have 7 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Verona Murphy. I began driving trucks at 19 years of age. I started a trucking company when I was 21 years old, taking meat from Ireland to Italy. That was 25 years ago, and today, though there have been many changes, I still take meat from Ireland to Italy, and for the same customers. In Ireland, a small medium truck company is 4 to 6 trucks and goes up to large companies of 500 trucks or more. As president of the Irish Road Haulage Association, I represent them. As you honourable people will be aware, we have just come through the worst recession in history, and we are about to face straight into Brexit. Ireland is the only EU country that shares a land border with the UK. Furthermore, the land border with Northern Ireland effectively means that Ireland will be an island within an island once the UK leaves the EU. The potentially devastating effect of a hard Brexit on the Irish economy and the Irish haulage industry cannot be overstated. There are approximately 3,700 licensed haulage operators at present in Ireland. The sector supports 50,000 jobs, accounting for approximately 2.5% of total employment in the Irish economy. Most of our members are based in rural areas throughout the country, providing local rural jobs. In addition to its strong employment contribution, the sector is also central to getting essential goods for consumers and businesses in and out of Ireland. 60% of trucks that leave Ireland are carrying the produce of indigenous Irish industry. As such, the sector provides the lifeblood for Irish commercial and consumer life. Each week, 1.2 billion of trade in goods and services is carried out between Ireland and the UK. Additionally, over 80% of road freight to mainland Europe travels through the UK. The effects of Brexit are already being felt by our members as they face an immediate and considerable threat to their viability arising from uncertainty associated with Brexit due to weakening of sterling and the lack of confidence in lenders about the future stability of the market. In the event of a hard Brexit, the likelihood is that there would be a border between the continent and the UK and between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Customs procedures would become more onerous and add to the cost borne by the Irish road haulage operators. Trucks crossing those borders might again be required to complete and possess the paperwork that drivers had to deal with prior to the opening of the single market in 1993. Carnets to cross borders may also have to be applied for. Such border restrictions would also lead to costly delays at ports and other border crossings. It is not certain that operators would be in a position to pass these extra costs on to their consumers, which would increase consumer prices and undermine consumer welfare. Absorbing those costs would further squeeze already tight margins and force more operators out of business. To deal with this, there must be the supporting infrastructure to allow rapid and efficient movement, adequate and secure parking and customs clearance facilities. Technology should be used to allow a fully digitalised and paperless customs procedure. In order to plan correctly, it is essential that the haulage industry views and considers considered during the negotiations. It is also essential that haulage industry is kept informed to allow haulage operators plan for the future instead of merely bracing themselves as they approach the cliff's edge. While still so little is known about the shape or nature of Brexit, the EU must acknowledge that whatever the outcome, Ireland must be protected, and any measures taken in the interim that affect Ireland must be carefully considered in the context of Brexit. For instance, the introduction of the mobility package will fundamentally change how hauliers operate within the EU. The suite of measures was conceived on the basis of the status quo and without Brexit in mind. It is difficult to see how such a comprehensive package can proceed before we know the full extent of the effect of the UK leaving the EU will have, particularly on Ireland. Ireland needs the EU to watch its back and to assist in every way it can to minimise the turmoil, inevitable increases in cost and loss of competitiveness. Introducing the mobility package at this time will do the exact opposite and will create a potential perfect storm. Already our Irish hauliers and their employees are affected disproportionately by the Working Time Directive, by the driver's hours regulations, and they were designed with mainland continent in mind. Already we have a cumbersome and inflexible regime which is inherently unsuited to island member states like Ireland, who must travel to and from mainland Europe by sea. The Irish road haulage industry is at the forefront of the economic relationship between the UK and Ireland and is at the forefront of the conduit between Ireland and mainland Europe. Policymakers in the EU must ensure that this vital component of Irish and European economic life is protected to the greatest extent possible. This can only be done by giving a commitment that our industry will have certainty in its operating environment through no new EU or state-imposed costs or charges for at least 36 months to allow time to navigate through what will be a difficult time for Ireland and Irish businesses. As an Irish haulier, it is clear to me, looking at the proposed timetable for the implementation of the mobility package, that the effect on Ireland in light of Brexit has not been considered. Ireland is a committed member of the EU. As an Irish businesswoman who employs EU citizens, I implore you as EU policymakers to acknowledge the reality of Brexit, particularly when debating the proposed mobility package. You must not allow Ireland to become a forgotten land off the far coast of Britain. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette...
Thank you very much for that initial presentation. Miss Murphy's microphone, please. Could we have Miss Murphy's microphone off? Okay. You conveyed a very clear message to all of us, while at the same time reminding us of our responsibility. The next speaker is Mr. Hookham. You have 7 minutes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to allow the FTA to speak this morning. My name is James Hookham. I am the Deputy Chief Executive of the Freight Transport Association. FTA is Britain's biggest transport trade association, with nearly 17,000 members that are dispatching and transporting goods, not just by road, but also by rail, by sea and by air. FTA is connected at European and global level. We have a counterpart organisation in Dublin that works closely with the IRHA. We are also founding members of the Global Shippers Forum, members of the IRU and the European Shippers Council and the European Logistics Platform. That is important because British manufacturers, importers and exporters see European supply chains as the single biggest issue that they face. The scale of trade is enormous. Our principal point is that Brexit will imply the creation of new borders between the UK and the EU 27. This will bring new checks. This will bring new requirements at the border, with the potential for disruption for UK and for EU businesses that will continue to trade with the United Kingdom. The scale of this trade is truly enormous, and it is important that all stakeholders comprehend what we are really talking about. The scale of trade between the UK with the rest of the EU amounts to some 8 times the volume of trade that has just been agreed in the new trade agreement between Europe and Canada. Some 185,000 enterprises will be required to make customs declarations and other border checks after Brexit for the first time in the UK. And 80% of the vehicles that cross the English Channel between France and England are actually EU 27 registered vehicles. So my point is that this is not just a UK issue, a UK risk. This is something that all stakeholders, all governments need to take an interest in. My key point for today is that there are 3 factors that critically affect the efficiency and effectiveness of future trade between the UK and the EU. Yes, there will be borders after Brexit, and they will affect the requirements that are placed on the freight that is carried. But as we've already heard, there are important risks around the availability of vehicle quotas, permission for vehicles to cross the borders, and there are also questions to clear up around the recognition of driver qualifications. These are the 3 principal risk areas that we see and that we are urgently seeking clarification on, not just from the UK government, but also from EU governments as well. And as you have just heard, we are intensely focused on the important trade routes and links between Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. So new checks at the border will require longer processing times. The risk is that these will create queues and delays, and we are anxious to avoid those as much as possible. The issue is that there is no physical space in the ports, in the roll-on, roll-off ferry ports, either in England or on the continental coast, or indeed in Ireland, and this is going to create congestion in those port areas and the risk of particularly long queues. The Port of Dover has recently estimated that for every additional 2 minutes of delay on clearing a vehicle through the current processing systems, every additional 2-minute delay will produce a queue of 27 kilometres in length, just given current trade flows. And one can imagine similar effects at Calais and indeed in proportion at other continental and Irish ports as well. So yes, this is a challenge for the UK government, but there is also, I submit, a challenge for EU 27 governments, but in particular for the governments of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and of course Ireland. New customs systems will be required. New documentation requirements need to be set out. We are already hearing stories that of recruitment of new enforcement staff, but these staff will need facilities, they will need to be trained in new procedures to cope with what in the UK will be an additional 300 million declarations that will be made in each year. The current level of declarations the UK customs system make is just 90 million. So there are orders of magnitude increase in the volume and scale of the challenges that we face here. My second point is about the need to ensure continuity of transit of vehicles. Because the UK government has declared its intention to leave the customs union and the single market, we presume that that will bring to an end the arrangement for community licences. That will mean there is no free movement of trucks, and unlike trading arrangements where there are fallback positions with the World Trade Organization tariffs and procedures, there is no default setting for the arrangements for accepting quotas of trucks to cross the border. The old system, the old ECMT system that was in use up until 1993 is unviable simply because the current quota numbers only manage to account for about 5% of the current volumes of trade. The volumes of trade moving between Dover and Calais are ample evidence of the success of the single market. The systems, the supply chains and the integrated methods of manufacture have responded to the opportunities and efficiencies that the single market has created, but all member states of the European Union now need to respond to the step changes that are coming, and this is important that it is recognised as an equal issue, an equal risk for both parties. This is not just a UK problem. Similar situations exist in rail, and I have very little to say on rail that I'm sure won't be covered in the future session, but it is important that you recognise that we need to have reciprocal arrangements for the movement of the freight trains and the qualifications of the drivers. My final point is to simply summarise our key takeaways and to summarise those by saying that we must accept that there are customs declarations that will be made, conformity checks will be required. There is a need not just for the UK government, but for other EU27 governments to step forward and to act. And I suspect that an implementation period will be required as much for government agencies to adapt and respond to Brexit as much as there will be for industry. Yes, we must seek to simplify and automate the procedures in the long run, but that will be something for the future. In the meantime, we must make sure vehicles can continue to cross the border and that there is mutual recognition of driver qualifications and licences. The UK balance of trade means that this is much an issue for the EU27 as it is for the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour votre...
Thank you for your presentation, in which you provided a series of quite frightening figures. Mr. Hookham's microphone, please. Mr. Hookham's microphone. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Kern for 7 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, merci beaucoup pour la parole et pour l'invitation.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for the invitation.
IRU is the World's Road Transport Organization. As you can see from the map here on the slide, the countries which are colored in dark blue is the countries where we would have an active membership today. Initially, after World War II, we were an international organization with a strong Western European footprint. This is indicated by the countries that are here marked in purple. Mobility in Europe, this is Eurostat figures. I think that's a very important slide because it outlines how important the sector is we work for, not just road, but transport in general. We're talking about 11 million jobs, and as you can see from the figures, with regard to the potential increase in freight and passenger transport by 2050, we will see an increase here of 60% on the freight side and more than 40% on the passenger side. So this is a growing business, and therefore it's important that we get a good Brexit deal for the road transport industry, because it is certainly a sector in Europe that matters. The priorities of IRU in the EU are threefold. As you can certainly imagine, the mobility package of the EU is very high on our agenda, decarbonization, and so is Brexit. Voila. So what do we want as IRU from Brexit, and what do we not want from IRU as a consequence of Brexit? This is in our position papers. Those papers have been released today. We have a focus on market access and customs. There is other issues that we would like to have addressed by the negotiators effectively, such as alignment of social conditions between the UK and the EU in the future, but also access to the labour market, certainly. Then some key points on Brexit. Within IRU, we have a task force which is pretty much in the driver's seat when it comes to the position building with regard to Brexit. No deal is no option. This is certainly something that we are calling for. We would like to have the status quo safeguarded in the course of a transition period. Every now and then people are approaching us, asking us, what are actually the no-go areas for you? What is what you do not want? And market access is very important for us. And a quota system, for example, that would potentially be highly disruptive to trade flows is something we would not want. We are proposing qualitative criteria when it comes to the access to the market on the UK and on the EU side. Now, what is the future of Brexit? Well, we don't know, because so far countries have exceeded the EU, and for this there is a certain process in place. You need to accept the EU acquis. There is inter- and intra-institutional cooperation that has to take place, but it's the first time that a country was considering to leave the EU. Therefore, we are all a bit in waters which are not really secure. We have, and therefore we might need to be very creative and, at the end of the day, and flexible when it comes to a good solution finding. There is different opportunities on the market today when it comes to customs arrangements. So we have looked into those opportunities. The Turkey case is a first option in which we looked. Turkey is in a partial customs union with the EU. Turkey and the UK are G20 economies. They both have a land border with the EU. Therefore, it is potentially at least comparable. Still, there is a hard border between the EU and Turkey, and this is what we not want. Therefore, the economic and trade flows are too high, and the situation is too integrated between the two economic partners. Similar for Norway. Even though here the customs procedures are highly streamlined, it is notably one customs officer, either a Finnish or a Norwegian colleague, respectively either a Swedish or a Norwegian colleague, which would check the truck at the border. Still, it is a customs process. And as we all know, the UK government has several times excluded this opportunity also for the country's future because of the competence of the European Court of Justice and also the free movement of people. Then there is the Swiss customs scenario in which we have looked in. The Swiss case is an interesting case. The cornerstone of the EU-Swiss relations is an FTA from 1972. These days there is around 100 agreements that would regulate the relationships between the EU and Switzerland. It is very complex to negotiate. It's also very complex to implement. This is what some say. Then there is others within the membership that say this is potentially a very flexible solution. Full divorce scenario, this is the potentially most disruptive scenario. If that happened after March 2019, it would leave the UK as a fairly independent country, still being bound to the law and regulations of international organizations and bodies such as the United Nations and the WTO. But this is the scenario which we do not want. We need to bear in mind that the UK is the second most important trade and economic partner for the EU, and therefore this would be too disruptive for our industry that we work for. Market access, as I've said already, we don't want quotas. We want that market access is ensured on the basis of qualitative criteria through a bilateral agreement between the EU and the UK. In terms of scope, we are here flexible. We say it can be a road transport agreement, knowing that the relationships are very complex between the EU and the UK. It can be also wider in scope, one comprehensive agreement. And a charming thing about having such a market access scenario is that you would not need authorizations before you hop on the truck and circulate the goods. So also here there is the potential for a no deal with regard to market access. In this case, we would need to have 27 individual agreements between the EU member states and the UK, which would lead to a fragmentation of the European market, which is unnecessary. And to conclude, what are our main messages? Those are basically 5. First of all, we would like to have frictionless road transport movements ensured post-Brexit between the EU and the UK, ensured through a sufficient transition period in the course of which we are safeguarding the status quo. Market access, again, no quota, but qualitative criteria. And since we are a very SME-driven industry, we don't want to see additional red tape as a consequence of Brexit. And first, and what is very important for us, is that the framework at the end is predictable and that we have legal certainty. Now I will finish off my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour vos...
I'd like to thank all 3 panelists for their presentations. Before opening this debate up for discussion, I'd just like to start by welcoming some guests invited by colleague Ms. Kloon. I'd like to welcome you to our committee today. I'm not quite sure where you are in the room. I think you're at the back. There you are. Welcome anyway. It's good to see you here today. So, after those 3 presentations, I'd like now to open the debate. I think you've actually put us under pressure with what you said. What you said was very clear, but what emerged clearly was the sense of urgency. One of you referred to the mobility package, which is something we'll be working on. You also referred to the administrative implications of Brexit, which could have a direct and considerable impact on the transport of goods. You're also calling for a transitional period. All I can say for the time being is that in the negotiations we are of course taking on board everything you said. And I know, Ms. Murphy, you suggested we try to slow down the mobility package so as to ensure the impact of Brexit can be taken on board. And we're very much aware of that, and we will try to do that. Clearly, the situation is worrying. So, Markus Pieper is our first speaker. Go ahead. Good morning, Mr. Pieper. Thank you for that very nice introduction. So, you did indeed sketch out a series of quite momentous problems. We have heard that 20% of staff in the committee will be dealing with Brexit. That gives you some inkling, I think, of the fact that just how annoying this is for us. Rather than looking to the future and charting out the future, we're involved with deconstructing the past. We had calls yesterday to ensure that we move to a free trade agreement as quickly as possible with the UK. And this was echoed in some of your contributions. There are a couple of points I'd like to pick up on. First of all, this magic word, digital border. We've heard a lot about scanning, blockchain technology, all sorts of technological solutions. So one option which has been floated is that the EU-UK border could be some kind of pioneer for the future, a digital border. This might actually be a technological opportunity which could be of benefit to us and act as a reference for others. That's my first question. My second question: transport legislation is subject to a great deal of EU regulation. I know that not all of you are very happy about that. Many of the rules represent red tape for you. So, are there certain areas where we can expect cherry picking? In other words, sectors will be saying, for example, if we leave the European Union, we want to start cherry picking rules. For example, rest time for drivers. In other words, for your sectors, are there potential gains if the UK leaves the complicated legislation handed down by the EU? Or do you think that the UK in your sectors will accept existing rules? That would send out a strong message to the European Union. That would make negotiations much easier. And that would also be a powerful argument to enable us to move towards a definitive solution, a good solution, much more quickly. If you were to say, we in the transport sector are paying a heavy price for Brexit, but we are willing to accept the compromise of sticking to existing rules so as to be part of the single market. So two questions: digital border and cherry picking. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Pieper. Mr. Herzog.
Danke auch von meiner Seite.
Thank you very much. The last thing you said, Miss Murphy, showed the dilemma we find ourselves in. You said that you, in Ireland, don't want to be Europe's forgotten country. I can promise you that the Socialist Group will be doing its utmost to ensure that won't happen. You are an important country in Europe. At the same time, what Mr. Pieper said is quite correct. It's not just the European side which gets to decide here. If it were up to members of the Transport Committee in the European Parliament to decide, things wouldn't be that difficult. The problem is, of course, is that we are just a subordinate component in the Brexit talks. We can make a contribution. We can make pointers as to how things could be simplified, and we can consult industry on both sides to see what they want. The problem, however, and this has been referred to quite clearly, is that we can't just start picking and choosing with this whole complex Brexit setup. We can't start negotiating on individual aspects. That would hollow out the whole debate. And that links in what we've just heard about cherry picking. EU27 can't accept that. We have to remember that the decisions we'll be taking over coming weeks and months will of course have an impact on other countries in the European Union. I must admit the figures are quite frightening. Clearly we don't want any extra bureaucracy and red tape. We don't want additional or new customs procedures. And we all know that every 2-minute delay leads to an extra 27 kilometres of traffic jams. So all of that is highly problematic. However, we can't close our eyes to the fact that the UK government has to move. The UK government has to tell us clearly what it's willing to offer. And we can't accept this idea of negotiating small issues. You called for a transitional period. It's perfectly possible that such a transitional period will be adopted. However, that will be of no real use if we don't find an overarching decision covering the Brexit process as a whole. So clearly there are enormous difficulties ahead. However, hearings such as the one today are very useful for us. It's good to hear from you what you don't want: quotas, additional customs procedures, additional bureaucracy and red tape. You want legal certainty and reliability. and we agree on that. However, obviously, as we've just heard, the real problem isn't in the hands of the Transport Committee, it's simply the overall agreement.
Monsieur Ertug, Madame Foster, la parole est...
Thank you, Mr. Herzog. Ms. Foster.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to the panellists for the information that they've provided. If I could just touch on what has been said, and certainly Ms. Murphy's comments, not only on the mobility package, she's quite right, I think, to raise that, because it is very comprehensive, and clearly that, as the Chairman has already said, she will obviously take this on board because it's hugely important. I also made note of other areas where there are challenges for the haulage industry, certainly when you're coming from an island, not just island, but as you said, which is really in the remit of the Employment Committee when we look at Workers' Time Directive and Drivers' Hours. And again, that will be probably another challenge for you to continue with, I think, as you go forward, because really when you're moving goods by sea, etc., it's a very different situation than going across land. With regards to Mr. Hookham's comments as well, I think you've given us very good information, figures, what the costs and all of these sorts of things can be. And you touched on driver qualifications. You touched on probably where we are in agreement cross-border now. I don't see that necessarily changing. I don't think there's been any indication, certainly from the British government, that first of all, they're looking at dumbing down social rules. There's been no indication at all of that changing any legislation. It's all in statute. I don't believe it's going to be going anywhere. And I think in issues such as driver qualifications and other reciprocal ways that we do things, I also don't see any change. I don't think it's necessary unless somebody's calling for that deliberately. I think a lot of this actually will just remain as is. I think we have very good standards in the United Kingdom, and I certainly, as a politician, wouldn't want to be looking at them being dumbed down, and that's not the indication I've certainly had from government level. I would also hope that you are certainly with the UK hat on, working on all of your lobbying and discussions with the departments for transport, ministers and officials. And because at the end of all of this, I think where I would certainly support our third speaker, Mr. Kern, is we've got to be looking for solutions. We do know what the challenges are, and we're sitting here looking at the cost on trade, jobs and all of those things. From my own point of view, I'm not looking at putting up any hard borders. I'm not looking at putting up tariffs where we don't need to, and that's not a UK position, as you, I think, quite rightly know. So it's about political will. It's about all of us, I think, coming together. It's not one country looking to have some special deal. It's about making sure at the end of this process that both sides, the 27 and the UK, there's a fair outcome to this, and that we can continue to trade as smoothly as possible. I think that that objective is clear. I think that that outcome can happen, and I think it'll also be industry and business and trade associations who will also come up with the solutions too. So do keep lobbying. I think you are being very well listened to. That's certainly the information I have. I'm working closely along with other colleagues, with our colleagues in Westminster and certainly over here as well in the European Union. I think it's been a very timely discussion today, and I'm very pleased certainly from Ireland's point of view that you are here. Because it really does focus minds for colleagues too from the other 27 states, just how important it is that we continue with that free flow of goods, trade, jobs and all of those sorts of things. And I think there can be a positive outcome. And thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Foster. Monsieur Tenuska, la parole.
Thank you, Ms. Foster. Mr. Tenuska.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for the enlightening presentations. I think that I would just start by reiterating what has been at least partly already said. I think that as concerns the implications for businesses, this committee is quite clear what the implications are, and I think that we listen and we will want to reflect, but I think that you should rather have a number of British ministers sitting here and a number of EU counterparts. I think that that is really the issue and the right address is, and unfortunately those that not necessarily are always getting it. Second, as concerns Ireland, I think that again full recognition and full support. But let me start by the remark that you have made as concerns the mobility package. Well, I'm not sure that I would share the the view of the chair that we can sort of delay it. I mean, honestly, I mean, there is that much at the moment at stake. The issues are that highly sensitive, and in fact, the package confronts a number of national, I mean, individual member states measures that I don't see that happening. I mean, in terms of timing, on the contrary, I think there will be a strong interest to push through with the mobility package as soon as possible, that we have, I would say, a legal certainty, consistency, and we have an EU ground and not individual member states. The issue rather is, what are the, let's say, elements of the package that have the most significant impact on you, that we might look into in terms of how that could be taken care of, either in terms of amendments, modification, eventually, I mean, a transition period, I mean, providing a facilitation, etc. So I would say that individual elements, that it would be good to hear from you, let's say, the 2 or 3 priorities that you see. Now, in terms of again, the implication and the arrangement, my understanding is clear. I mean, we will have to have a transition period. And that is clear. I mean, whatever would happen between now and the actual exit, you know, it's not manageable, it's not achievable. So there will be a transition period. I would even say that if we speak today of a 3-year transition period, I mean, having negotiated Czech accession, I have doubts that even that is manageable, to be honest. Yeah? Even if we start those negotiations pretty soon, it is as demanding as that. So I think that, as Jacques Foster has said, the lobbying, the clear indication of the implications to the relevant quarters is absolutely vital, because I'm not sure that everyone understands, you know, the timeline of the whole process that should lead to an outcome which will be plus minus a desired one, or that would be limiting really the implications. And once again, you know, it would be also good to hear from you in terms, as a result of the lobbying, what is the feedback that you are getting? I mean, I can understand, you know, that it's politically difficult to say, okay, we will be a part of the internal market. But what is the feedback you are getting as concerns your lobbying on customs union on both sides? I mean, this for me is difficult to comprehend, apart from the fact that it's purely political. But I mean, all the arguments are in favor. And final remark on Ireland, if I may ask a question. You know, I think we understand that there are political and economic issues. One, the political is the open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. For a number of reasons, I would say even security reasons. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, I don't want to dwell into details, but clearly there will have to be a border. I mean, so from your perspective, Ms. Murphy, is it you know, more advisable to have the UK-Ireland border, or the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland? I mean, I'm now talking about the trade between Ireland and the UK. Of course, the continental can come via sea. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Telinska.
Thank you, Mr. Telinska. Perhaps I could just correct something. When it comes to the mobility package, I wasn't suggesting for a moment that we can change the timetable. We simply can't do that. The mobility pact has been launched, and we are obliged to stick to the timetable. Within the mobility package, however, the message we've had this morning as to the need to try to anticipate the effects of this package on you, that is something that we can talk about in the mobility package, but we simply can't change the calendar. It's as simple as that.
La parole.
Mr. Taylor, over to you. Perhaps I could ask speakers to try to be a little bit shorter in their comments, so as to give our panellists the chance to respond to what's been said. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the panel for some very interesting points that you've made. I think it's been very useful for us to know what your emerging priorities are. What I would like to ask you, each of you, is what contingency planning you have made, because in the event of Britain leaving the customs union, which is going to be happening in April 2019, what advance planning are you making for then? Because I know what you want, but what arrangements are you predicting that you will need, particularly in relation to the Irish border issue? because I can see there's all sorts of problems and not enough people, either side of the channel, really know what the implications and the likely outturn is going to be. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Taylor. Monsieur Lundgren.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Lundgren.
Tack så mycket och välkommen hit till gästerna.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Welcome to our guests. It's very nice to see a female lorry driver, Ms. Murphy. I myself was a truck driver for 30 years before I became an MEP in 2014. I was the first truck driver ever to be a member of the European Parliament. I also worked in international road haulage for 10 years. So, of course, the thing is, we don't know precisely what the situation in the UK will be. We're still not really aware of what the final Brexit position is. We don't even really know what the UK wants in some cases. And Parliament has remained in the dark, but of course we're very unhappy that the UK has voted to leave, and now there's a bit of a tug of war to see which side can come out of this better. And this, of course, is something that has happened in the transport sector. We had customs barriers in the past in Europe, and the question is, what's the best way to handle the customs issue? For a long time, it was highly bureaucratic. I've remembered myself hanging around for an extremely long time just to get through customs formalities in Europe. And the important thing is that the solution is a fair one. I'm hopeful that common sense will prevail and that we'll come up with solutions which will be effective for the transport sector, because this is something which is highly international by definition. I want to know whether you have a plan B. Do you have some sort of alternative strategy? Even though I'm hopeful that this whole thing will be sorted out to our mutual satisfaction, but there's still a lot of differences between the EU and the UK. The Chair. So is there a plan B? Indeed, that's an interesting question. A very big question, of course, as well. Have you anticipated, I'm addressing all our guests, these problems? We've got these very worrying figures that have been mentioned in terms of the market and access to customs, etc. So, but Mr. Lundgren's question, have you anticipated, even among yourselves, some kind of roadmap if there is no agreement, if there is the hard Brexit? What are you going to do then? And Marcus Pieper mentioned the whole idea of the digital border. How is that going to be set up? Mr. Ertug said that the Irish Republic, of course, doesn't want to be left out in all of this, and the mobility package was referred to as well, and the impact this will have on the transition period. Obviously, it's not up to us to decide how long that period is going to be, but are you having meetings? Are you talking to the UK government to try to work out what they're going to do about the transition period? And also, there's the question of the drivers, your drivers, obviously. What's going to happen to them, the social aspects of this if the United Kingdom leaves the legal framework provided by the European Union. So, I'll give you 2 minutes to answer all of those questions. So we really are trying to have a proper exchange of it. But Madam Murphy, you go first.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your interest and questions. And in relation to the time factor of the mobility package, I understand, but I don't think from a practical perspective, anybody sitting that has posed the question to me in relation to we can't delay it. Of course you can. The reality is that we are worldwide facing a huge shortage of drivers. The regulation that we currently operate under is quite sufficient, although there is a lot of talk about social dumping and what drivers they can't spend their time in the truck when they take their 45-hour break. It may be misunderstood that these people are not chained to the steering wheel of the truck. They are quite free to do what they wish with their time, but to sleep in a bed that they are familiar with. I slept in a hotel last night that cost me in excess of €300, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, watching the ceiling, waiting for this opportunity, because I was in a strange room, in a strange bed with a bad pillow. And I couldn't sleep. So do you think it's good for the driver to operate a truck after 2 days of not sleeping in a strange bed? That's the practical aspect. The other aspect is who is going to pay for the hotel that the driver or the accommodation he must sleep in? Will the driver suffer from his wages perspective? All these are proposals from your mobility package, but nothing is the practical solution, and nobody ever checks with the driver or the haulier as to what the practical solution actually is. They don't work. Your current regulation of tachograph is very, very disadvantageous to a geographic country, an island nation such as Ireland. It will take us 1 day extra to get to mainland Europe because of Brexit. That is bad for Ireland Inc., and in turn it's bad for me as a haulier because the consumer doesn't buy. The product is losing value. If that happens, everything I want to, there is no increase in the sales. It puts us back into a recessionary period. And if somebody asks me what my contingency plan is, it is to give up my haulage business and to become an MEP. That is the best I can tell you, because I have no idea what planning Mr. Taylor suggests I should undertake as a haulier. I don't know what customs procedures are intended, because all of the talking is still going on. But what I do know is that the mobility package will add to the woes of Brexit. Too much change at once, and Ireland will be the most affected country. A Donegal haulier coming from the northwest of Ireland must cross 4 borders before he gets to mainland Europe. That's not a Swiss comparison, a Norwegian comparison, or a Turkish comparison. They only have to do it once. So we must do it 4 times, and for a driver, as you will know, Mr. Lochman, to do that 4 times is painstaking. For somebody in a uniform who is badly trained, because there is no preparation of customs at the moment. Nobody has been recruited in Ireland to undertake customs duties. They have not been in Ireland for the number of years that borders are down, but all the regulations such as the tachograph was already compiled in 2006 when there were no borders. Now you want us to operate under the same and more regulation when there are borders, but it only affects Ireland. Be under no illusion. It doesn't affect the Germans, it doesn't affect the French in the same way. We must cross an island to get to mainland Europe, from an island to mainland Europe. We are going to be greatly disadvantaged, and don't for a minute think that as the elected representatives you can't delay the mobility package. There are aspects that can be delayed. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks very much. I can feel the emotion in that. Thank you very much. On we go, Mr. Hookham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'd like to start addressing a number of the comments and questions that have been made by making what I think is probably the most important observation to a parliamentary committee, that as we go through the next few weeks, the balance of decision-making will shift from the political arena to the commercial arena. Because in the European supply chain and logistics market, as we speak, contracts are being negotiated, contracts are being agreed that will be in force and be affecting the movement of goods in the second quarter of 2019. And Freight Transport Association members and members of many other associations are contacting us to ask what are the prices that we quote under the different Brexit scenarios. And if the political audience cannot give us that answer, then we will have to make those decisions, make those assumptions ourselves. And that means that eventually the decisions will be made in a commercial context because businesses will want to keep trading, they will want to keep their customers supplied, they will want to keep goods on the move. So the contingency planning questions that have been asked by Mr. Taylor and some of the issues that I was discussing about needing clarity and certainty about what arrangements we'll be working under, businesses will begin to assume the worst situation and will start to plan for a hard Brexit and indeed a no-deal Brexit as a worst-case scenario. Now, that's not to say that we've given up, but it does mean to say that businesses are having to make decisions to keep the European economy moving, and they will start to make the investments to recruit the staff and to implement the procedures that will allow them to cope with the worst outcome scenario. That would be a tragedy. It would be a waste of money, one would hope, but it would be a logical and sensible business decision to make given the uncertainties and given the risks. So this is an important few weeks. My advice to our members as to what they should actually be doing is, if at all possible, they should await the outcome of the European Council meeting on the 14th and 15th of December and hope that the debate can move on to serious discussion and negotiations about the detail of a new trade agreement in which all of the issues that we have been discussing this morning need to be incorporated. And my point about driver qualifications, to Ms. Foster's point, is that I don't think we are seeking to change anything. We just don't want to these important recognition issues of qualifications and indeed permits for vehicles to be forgotten in the rush and in the urgency of concluding the trade agreement. Because there is very little point having a trade agreement if the vehicles in which most of the trade will move aren't actually allowed to move and the drivers are not allowed to cross the border. So that was my principal point on there. I fully support and accept the need that we mustn't let new border controls go back to the way that they were done and conducted in 1992. And as a contribution to assisting not just UK customs authorities, but all agencies in the EU27 that are affected by this, the FTA has produced its 10-point plan to simplify and automate customs procedures with a view to reducing whatever new requirements are put in place and to return to as close a frictionless arrangements as possible. This is not anything new. The UK and EU27 member states trade with many other countries around the world under the WTO rules, so we know what hard borders look like. We need to adapt them to the high frequency and volumes of traffic that move between our respective countries, but this can be done. It needs not just the business will and determination, it also needs a political will as well. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Kern.
Thank you, Mr. Kern.
Merci beaucoup. So thank you very much for all your interventions and comments. I would like to perhaps be brief, echoing perhaps pretty much everything that our two members have just said in their wrap-up. Perhaps focusing on three key aspects. Number one is a question that Mr. Taylor has come forward with. What arrangements do you actually need post-Brexit on the customs side? This is, I think, a very important question. And I think what is really important for the industry is that whenever you clear a truck, the goods inside the load compartment, that this happens inland, in the hinterland, that this does not happen at the border. We have heard the figures that Mr. James has provided us with. this morning. So if we even thought of having such arrangements in place post-Brexit on the customs side, where we would not clear everything inland, but everything at the border, we would have queues which would be too long in order to sustain the trade flows effectively between the EU and the UK. So that's the first point. The second point, a point that Mr. Pieper made on the digital border. This is very important. We acknowledge that technology is evolving. We embrace that, especially when we're talking risk assessment and what can we all do today in order to see what is actually inside the truck, in order to have a safer homeland potentially as well. That's important. And we fully stand up to the commitments that we have in this respect. But as I've said, technology is evolving fast, it is moving fast, and this challenges the legislator, because in most cases technology moves faster than the legislative process. And this will be certainly a challenge for all of us to have the legislation in place at the right time to catch up with the developments on the tech side. If all this of the tech side is affordable and priced competitively on the market, then we have also no problem in buying these items in. But at the end of the day, it was not the decision of the road transport industry and our operators to have this split now within the EU. Third point, so when we are now talking phase 2, hopefully very soon, as of December, I think it is absolutely vital that road transport as a part of the future relationships will be top of the agenda. Simply because, as again James has just put it, one can have as many nice and tailor-made agreements with regard to all sorts of sectors, products, commodities, what have you. If those products are not being transported on time to the client, then all those tailor-made agreements are toothless tigers. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour cette première.
Thanks very much to the colleagues in the first panel. Now we'll start the second section of questions, and these will be only 1-minute questions because we don't want to encroach on the time for our second panel. Mrs. McGuinness is first Vice President of the European Parliament. I'm very pleased to see you here this morning in our committee, Madam. But please, go ahead and welcome.
Well, thank you for the welcome and indeed for this hearing. I'm at a loss to actually ask a question because there are so many. So why I came to the meeting was to show support to the work you're doing, but also to my colleague Verona Murphy. And I know that many of you would have regarded her intervention as an emotional one, which it is, because the sense of uncertainty and alarm in Ireland about access to markets is profound. And we cannot really give an answer to that uncertainty until we see progress in the first phase of the negotiations. So my question perhaps is a rather on the downside. For businesses, what is the time frame where this uncertainty becomes unbearable to the point where different decisions have got to be taken? Because some of what I've heard is reassuring, but I'm not sure there's a plan B when we don't even know at this point where we're starting from in terms of the future partnership. But I do want you to know, colleagues that are not from the island of Ireland, that there is a profound sense of unease and uncertainty. We need to trade. We're a small nation. We need access to markets, and we need it rapidly. And we need the current system to remain rather than be altered significantly. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame McGuinness.
Thanks, Ms. McGuinness. Mrs. Meissner, you're our next speaker.
I'm doing this intervention in English. Well, of course, I try to have it rather short. Maria just said, you are in a small nation, you need trade. You need trade. I absolutely agree with you. And I met already representatives of the Ministry of Ireland, the Transport Ministry, and my question is quite simple. First of all, do you have any idea what would it cost additionally for you if the Brexit really would be fulfilled doing the transport trade in future? And a second question is there any negotiation ongoing between your Ministry for Transport in Ireland and the rest of the EU, so the other 27 member states? Because you cannot be punished if Great Britain wants to be out. You are a member in future as well. So the two questions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Meissner. Madame Anderson.
Thanks, Ms. Anderson.
It's welcome to see the panel talk about the importance of standards. And I did want to emphasise that we need to tie this down legally. Now, contrary to what Jackie Foster has said, unfortunately, I don't accept the fact that the UK government is completely committed to ensuring that all the relevant standards are implemented. Senior Conservative politicians have been very clear that actually that is not what they want to do. So to give you one example, Mr Duncan Smith, who was a previous Secretary of State, said, once Brexit is completed in 2019, we should prepare to carry out a root and branch review of the cost of regulatory burden of its intrusions into the daily lives of the citizens and businesses of the UK. And I'm afraid it'll be for the EU side to insist legally that these matters are dealt with. So whether it's a version of the Swiss agreement with an annex saying all of these issues to do with safety and social rights must be included, the EU side needs to make this priority. And Michel Barnier has said that, and I would hold him to those figures on that particular issue, and I think it's very important. So we're talking about qualifications, licensing, hours, not in the burdensome sense, but because we want a level playing field going forward. So it would be good to get your comments on that, because legally it absolutely needs to be tied down, whether it's in a trade agreement, a bilateral agreement or a Norway type arrangement.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Anderson.
Thanks, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Van Dalen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I deeply regret Brexit, and somehow I sort of hope that it somehow won't go through. But if it does, I hope that in any case it won't be a hard Brexit, because it's not just a question of the road transport that's going to be affected. There are so many sectors that are going to suffer: aviation, fisheries, and, you know, I could go on and on. I have two questions to Ms. Murphy and Mr. Kern. First, are undertakings going to think about moving, relocating? Are there signs already that Irish hauliers might plan to go and set up headquarters on the continent? Secondly, you were talking about the perfect storm which is brewing. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je donne Madame la parole à...
Ms. Lukashenska.
Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę Państwa, nie zapominajmy, że Brexit to koszty nie tylko dla firm transportowych z 27 krajów Unii Europejskiej, ale także koszty dla firm transportowych.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's not just a question of the costs that are going to be caused to hauliers, but all business people in the UK, because it's going to be a problem of access to the EU market, turnover on exports to the European continent are 8 times that in exports to Canada. So it's going to be a huge problem. Anyway, I want to ask a question. What costs are transport companies going to incur and consumers going to incur as a result of this development? And my second question is this. We're working on the mobility package in the European Parliament, and members from the UK are very active on this legislation. Do you think, ladies and gentlemen, that the new principles for cabotage in international transport and new rules for recognition of professions and other regulatory standards, do you think they ought to still apply to the UK following Brexit? And will that facilitate the work of transport companies?
Mr. Riquet, first of all, Brexit isn't some natural disaster. It's the outcome of the UK political process. Secondly, the consequences are going to be highly asymmetrical between the UK side and the EU side. That explains why there's these different timings that the sides are putting forward. And thirdly, when it comes to transport, it's something that is going to depend on the general political solution. That's why it's so difficult to talk about these matters. I won't take even my whole minute because I've only got one question. Are there any advantages to Brexit that our three speakers have discovered? Thanks very much, Chairman.
Monsieur Van de Kamp,
Mr. Van der Kamp.
Mevrouw de voorzitter, dank.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I'm sorry, we just lost the microphone. We belong to a minority who are still Brexit deniers. We still think it won't happen. Maybe there's still some hope for me there. But anyway, my question is to Mr. Hookham, sorry. Are you still lobbying against Brexit? Are you still lobbying the British government? And secondly, shouldn't we try to go for a long transition period? A long transition period could perhaps reduce some of the political damage. In other words, if we just approach this as rational human beings with common sense. And in response to Ms. Murphy, I agree with Mrs. McGuinness that we have to do everything that we can to help Ireland, but to postpone the mobility package because of Brexit would be a bad idea. We would be punishing ourselves twice over then, so I think that wouldn't be acceptable.
Van de Kamp, Monsieur
Thanks, Mr. Van der Kamp. Mr. Kramer, 1 minute, please, sir.
Ja, ich habe
Thank you very much. I have two questions. In the EU, of course, we do have relations with third countries, with Norway and Switzerland. But we at least would have had an agreement with them if the UK hadn't been against that. Will you do what you can to make sure that these rules and regulations can apply? In other words, that when the UK leaves, they can be at least treated in the same way as Switzerland and Norway. And my next question is on the Channel Tunnel. How will things work there? Do you have any proposals of how that will work? How are you going to lobby about that?
Thanks, Mr. Kramer. Well, a lot of questions there, which we're going to ask for answers for without a great deal of time. I'd like just to pick up on what Ms. McGuinness said. She mentioned the concern, the uncertainty. What's the thing that you're going to need to dissipate this uncertainty? Because it really is definitely there. And the question of costs. How much is it going to cost, this whole Brexit thing? Not just for consumers or transporters. And also, Mr. Riquet, are there any advantages to Brexit? That's a rather provocative question. And Mr. Van der Kamp, he doesn't believe in Brexit. Do you think in your sector, is there an anti-Brexit lobby trying to stop it actually happening? Anyway, I won't run through all the questions, but I think they're all very important questions, and I'll give the floor first of all to Ms. Murphy for 2 minutes to try and field them. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you again to everybody. I would like particularly to acknowledge Mairead McGuinness, who is a very good friend of the association and the Irish hauliers, as well as our colleagues here, Ms. Deirdre Gounon, who sits on the Transport Committee, and Horaid Turlock. They're all very good to us, and they keep us informed, and they give us many opportunities. I would like to say, in answer to your question, Mairead, Brexit for the Irish haulier and for Irish businesses has actually occurred. The 20% fluctuation in the currency has meant that the 6 counties of Northern Ireland and the operators within can work in the Southern Ireland hemisphere at a 20% deficit. It is causing us huge problems. It is already It is happening as we speak. So 20% of a haulage industry that operates on margins of maybe 3 to 4%. That might give you some understanding as to why the financial institutions and the lenders are very concerned about our sector. In relation to the Department of Transport and the consultation of our department with other EU departments, absolutely, there is great consultation. We ourselves are in great consultation with them. We sit with the Customs Consultative Committee. We've been through all of the options. We produced a Brexit document very early in 2017 that estimated the cost per truck for 4 hours delay as 200 million in the first year of Brexit. It won't come from the sector. I will go out of business if I have to endure that cost. I will have no option. I'm a small medium enterprise. I operate 4 trucks, 2 of which I don't have drivers for. And sitting on my forecourt, that is a loss to the Irish Exchequer of €500,000, at least 100,000 euros in taxes. But there's nothing I can do because I cannot get drivers. And it doesn't mean if I move my business to any other country in Europe that that will change, because every country is operating under the same pressure. But ours has the added disadvantage of the sterling affecting us greatly. The standards in the UK, particularly in relation to road transport, are very, very high. We adhere to them and we expect that they will continue. We're used to their practices and I don't think that they will lower their standards, particularly not in relation to road safety. Mr. Van Dalen asked, undertakings going to move? Again, I say no, because I, as a small enterprise, I couldn't afford a move. I won't be able to afford the administration costs of the mobilities package proposed Posted Workers Directive. How can I bear the cost of translating my contract for my drivers into 5 languages? We already pay the second highest minimum wage in Europe, and yet I'm supposed to justify to 5 or 6 other countries that I do that in their language. Nobody gives me anything towards the cost of doing this. Where do I find a translator, an Austrian translator? Or I might go to the embassy, but then you pay maybe 200 euros. All of these things are practical applications, what I do on a day-to-day basis. And the burden and the legislation, regulation, administrative burden is pretty great. And I think one question that we will all ask ourselves post-Brexit is, why did it happen? And do we need another island to exit from the other 27? Because the burden will be very, very heavy as we can only move east. And each time we move east, it's costing us more money. That's from the Irish perspective.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hookman. Hookham, sorry.
I would like to endorse Verona Murphy's point about there is no expectation or demand amongst members of the Freight Transport Association to conduct a route and branch review of road transport legislation. In soundings we have made of our members, all responsible vehicle operators, whether in the haulage sector or in the own account sector, respect the need for safe, efficient and sustainable transport. And although we may have had views on the original directives and regulations when they were passing through the negotiations in this place and in the Council, we live and abide by the standards that are in place. So it is important, though, that mutual recognition of that situation is legally recognised and continued through Brexit. It's more a technical point that I was trying to make, that this does need to be picked up and recognised in any final outcome. The costs obviously depend on how severe and how hard the Brexit is, what the degree of friction is at the border. It costs, though, we estimate about £1 a minute for a vehicle to stand in a queue doing nothing. And when we're talking about the lengths of queues that we've been discussing earlier, you quickly see very large sums of money are simply wasted because of new inefficiencies that are introduced. Are we lobbying to stop Brexit? Well, it's very important that you understand that the business community generally and the Freight Transport Association in particular recognise that, as has been said by a member earlier, that this was a vote of the British electorate. It was not something that British industry and commerce took a particular position in. But we are relentless and we are unremitting in pointing out the consequences of Brexit, particularly a hard Brexit, on freight transport and distribution and on European supply chain efficiency. And as I said before, that is not just a matter for the UK, it is a matter for the EU27 as well. And on a positive note, are there advantages of Brexit? Well, yes, there are, because I don't think the Freight Transport Association would have had the opportunity to come and tell you, members of the European Parliament, what a brilliant job the supply chain industry does to keep Europe moving unless we cut into this situation. So one advantage for me is that you all and your colleagues take a far greater interest in the need for more efficient, sustainable and safer supply chains and join us in that mission. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Kern, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. So with regard to the question of Monsieur Riquet, are there advantages to Brexit? In our membership, the members are rather concerned. Again, we are facing a challenge that we have not faced yet, so there's a lot of uncertainty between the members, especially also because of the slow pace that the negotiations have been conducted so far. This is rather worrying for us, so we do not see advantages of the Brexit process for our industry as a first point. Now, Madam Lukaszewska had a question with regard to cabotage, whether that will still be applied post-Brexit. Well, the cabotage rules, as we know them within the EU, do not apply to third countries. There's no cabotage. So everything you would then agree on with your British partners would be subject to individual agreements which you would then stipulate rights and obligations, especially with regard to permits. So this will then have to be seen. Companies, are companies going to move? Well, I think road transport companies, with regard to this question, are not a lot different than any other company, right? If you are very deeply rooted within your community, when you're an SME, family-driven, etc., it is more difficult for you to move and to set up a branch elsewhere than when you're a bigger company, right? So I would not rule that out that bigger companies could potentially set up branches elsewhere as a consequence of Brexit. Then, yes, we are not calling for a second referendum. We accept Brexit the way it is. We're trying to mitigate the damages. We've always called for trade facilitation and sustainable development as IRU, and we'll keep on doing that, trying to mitigate the damage. Thank you very much.
Un dernier mot de Madame Murphy. Allez-y.
One last word from Mrs. Murphy.
Just to go back and say that I think the only advantage we have discovered is duty-free will be reintroduced.
Ce premier panel est terminé. Je voudrais...
Well, that brings that first panel to an end. I think a round of applause for our panelists.
Vraiment pour la qualité.
Thank you very much. That's well deserved for the high quality of your presentations, for your expertise, and also for clearly giving us the message that there are no advantages to Brexit. We all agree with you there. You've painted a rather bleak scenario, a lot of uncertainties, a lot of concerns, with some very concrete concerns, new customs tariffs, increased costs, administrative burden, increasing controls. Certainly, these are all worries we're going to have to take into account. And don't worry, we'll also be keeping a close eye on the negotiations ourselves. But of course, for the time being, we are powerless because, like you, the negotiations are lagging behind, and we're not really involved in that first phase of negotiations. But thank you very much. The door of our committee is always open to you, and don't worry, you will always have an opportunity to express your views to us. Thank you very much. And now I will ask our second panel to kindly step up here without further ado, and we'll move on in our agenda.
Le transport ferroviaire.
Moving on now to rail transport.
Thanks for having us, Madame Daly. Merci beaucoup.
Bah oui.
À la prochaine.
Super.
Take a seat,
Très bien, vous me dites ça de navette, bravo.
Ça va, on n'est pas en retard, on est dans les temps, on est dans le temps. Allez.
Eurotunnel, je suis
Okay.
pas
Allez, nous continuons.
Let's continue then with our analysis of the consequences of Brexit, now on rail transport. And it's a great honour and pleasure for me to have beside me people we are familiar with, familiar faces. Jacques Gounon, Chief Executive Officer of Eurotunnel. Thank you for being with us today. And welcome as well to our Transport Committee, Libor Lochman, Executive Director of the European Railways Committee. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And Ms. Laura Wright, representative of the Rail Delivery Group, particularly with regard to freight. This is an extremely important aspect in the second panel. So you will each have 7 minutes, like the previous panel, to tell us what your feelings are about the implications and consequences of the departure of the UK on your sector, and to give us an idea of what you would look to us as Transport Committee or the EU to do to somehow palliate the negative effects. We've seen terrible effects in the road transport. Presumably you'll be suffering similar impacts. So I'll give the floor first of all to Ms. Wright. 7 minutes, madam.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm Laura Wright. I'm the Head of International Policy at the Rail Delivery Group. And the purpose of Rail Delivery Group is to bring together both Britain's main infrastructure manager, Network Rail, and our passenger and freight operating companies to succeed by working together, providing services for their customers. And our railway is the backbone of the British economy. It employs around 240,000 people, moves 4.5 million people around Britain each day, and 86 million tonnes of freight each year. And this spreads wealth to every part of the country. And these statistics are multiplied over and over again in your own member states across the European Union. And as a sector that imports and exports both goods and services, transports people across borders, and possesses Britain's only physical link to mainland Europe, getting Brexit right for the rail industry will be a barometer for whether the overall deal will enable Britain and Europe to prosper together in the decades ahead. And for RDG, we have 3 priorities for the Brexit negotiations. 1, reciprocal market access. 2, smooth cross-border travel. And 3, our people who are employed in the sector. So on reciprocal market access, we see the 4th railway package and the great work that this committee undertook on this dossier as a recipe for success for the railways. Opening markets, driving innovation, and delivering benefits for passenger and freight customers. And foreign involvement in the British franchising market is well documented, and we should welcome the jobs and investment that international transport businesses have wanted to bring to Britain, and to learn from and build on our successes. But British businesses are also increasing their presence in mainland Europe, and we want to make sure that these companies have access to existing and newly liberalising markets so we can export our expertise. And whilst reciprocal market access is in the hands of negotiators at the highest level, we will continue to support competition for service contracts in Britain and also seek to enter markets overseas. Smooth cross-border transport. And we've heard a lot about this already in the panel this morning on roadside. But the Channel Tunnel for us is a vital transport link between mainland Europe and the UK. And smooth transport across this border is a critical link we see in the single European rail area, even when the UK becomes a third country. To enable travel through the Channel Tunnel for our freight members, trains need to conform to technical standards which are recognised by both the EU and the UK. And train driver licences, like we heard with road driver licences this morning, have to be mutually recognised to enable them to operate across borders and into France, Belgium and beyond. And whilst there's no intention on the part of the operators or indeed the infrastructure managers on the cross-border routes to change technical conformity, it's essential that this mutual recognition of operating and train driver licences continues.
Can you speak more slowly, please? Okay.
Apologies.
Okay.
I'm giving the translators a hard time. So, as I was saying, there's no intention on the part of the operators or the infrastructure managers on the cross-border route to change technical conformity. It's essential that the mutual recognition of operating and train driver licences continues. And we don't know exactly what Brexit is going to look like. However, in a scenario where operating licences are no longer mutually recognised and there's no contingency plan in place, operations could be more challenging. For example, without mutual recognition of driver licences, freight train drivers may have to hold 2 licences or change drivers at the border. However, I believe that with cooperation between governments and regulators, we can find a solution. A membership of the EU Customs Union currently allows UK businesses to export and import goods without rules of origin declarations, health, veterinary and safety controls and the delays in transit that these incur. This has had the consequence on current infrastructure on both sides of the tunnel has been designed with a simplified process for goods. And all freight through the Channel Tunnel, including the Ro-Ro services, represent a quarter of the trade between the EU27 and the UK. And without significant investment in infrastructure, customs officers and technology, such as VACIS scanners, it is highly likely that there could be an impact on both the French and the British rail networks as trains queue to be inspected. This would have a knock-on effect on other networks across mainland Europe. On people, we also need to consider the talented European colleagues who have made Britain their home. Nearly 41,000 of nationals of the EU27 are currently employed in the rail industry in Britain. Many work for EU27-owned businesses in the operators and the supply chain. These companies often rely on the ability to easily second staff into their UK base for periods of a few months to several years. It is very important to maintain this ability. Current and future freight operators using the Channel Tunnel will have drivers and crew of multiple EU27 nationalities due to skills, working patterns and their location of their home depots. There has to be a cost-effective solution to this type of working. And the EU27 also rely on the exchange of knowledge and skills of both their own nationals and UK nationals and the ability to work on similar projects across different countries. For example, Crossrail is Europe's largest infrastructure project, and it's employed over 15,000 people since it began in 2009. It's estimated that around 15% of Crossrail's employees are EU27 nationals, all of whom can take the specialist skills and knowledge gleaned from this project to other major tunnelling and infrastructure projects across Europe. We must continue to use our skilled workforce to learn and grow. The free flow of people of all levels of skill is critical to our railways, not only to deliver a competitive market for rail, but also to share unique experience from challenging projects. So in conclusion, the rail industry in Britain is committed to working closely with our government and colleagues in Brussels to develop plans for the UK leaving the EU. We want these plans to support the single European rail area, promoting benefits for passengers and freight customers across the EU. I hope the beginning wasn't too quick and the translators managed with the second half, but thank you very much for your time.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So we will now move on. Mr. Lochman, you also have the floor for 7 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everybody. I have a very pleasant role, to continue after the colleagues from the road that have expressed, of course, the number of the concerns that are common to rail side, and after Laura, that has been quite, I would say, significantly outlining the issues that are really on our agenda. So, at the first place, the CR, as you may know, represents the majority of the European businesses that are moving on the European tracks, both on the continental as well as the British Rail, because the RDG is our member, and we represent the interests of them vis-à-vis you, the policymakers in Brussels. So what's our concerns here? In the first place, and thanks to you and thanks to your efforts in the past decades, I would even say that we have been able to quite recently establish what we call today a regulatory single European rail area. And we want to continue that, obviously. We don't wish to depart from what we have today. And for us, the single European rail area does not only mean that expansion of the area towards the candidate states towards the east or southeast, but also keeping what we have already established in a connection with the United Kingdom. So this is for us I would say, the presumption of what needs to happen in the future with regards to the regulatory framework. So legal certainty of the businesses, that will be possible also after the Brexit will take place. Access to the market, I'm not going to repeat what Laura said already. We have got, again, as a part of the legislation, mutual access to the rail markets, both in the UK as well as in Europe, or continental Europe, to say it more correctly. We wish to continue that, because that's what will be beneficial for our customers, both on the freight and the passenger side, and this is something what must not be disrupted. And whether we talk about the freight, I said, or whether we talk about passenger services in both under the PSO contracts or the commercial services, it needs to continue. It needs to continue, so we need to have also the good cooperation between the regulatory entities on both sides of the channel in future. Mobility of staff. What else to add on top of what has been said by the road colleagues or Laura? Again, we need to have the movement of the people in order to benefit from the knowledge, from the experiences, from the talents. Otherwise, we will be really suffering as a Europe with regards to the competitiveness of Europe as such. So that's, again, the component that it's just reiterating what has been said before. Now, a little bit closer to the technical rules. We really have been able now to start, and we are now starting the implementation of the single European rail area from the technical perspective, implementing or transposing and implementing the interoperability and safety directives and using the new roles and responsibilities of the European Union Agency for Railways. And at the same time, we are running the risk that there will be a barrier set across the border with the UK that will be completely disruptive to that. So what needs to be done is that when we will be implementing the four-sail package on the technical side, on the technical pillar, the same will be mirrored also on the side of the UK. So there will be really a principle of the mutual recognition taking place. There will be also the possibility of accepting the recognition of the train driver's license. And on top of that, that also in the future we will have a good cooperation across the border, so to say, between the UK and the Union with regards to the communication cooperation aside of the European Union Agency for Railways, and with regards to the cooperation of the experts also belonging to the pool of those who need to rule, in fact, the technical regulation on both sides. So that's absolutely inevitable. Otherwise, we will really come to the situation that what we have been building since the last 2 decades to bringing the rail together, we start again letting that to collapse. One particular point, which is also on the agenda of you, after the Commission has presented, in fact, the mobility package, and now even the second part with regards to the to the Combined Transport Directive. We need also to keep an eye on what will be the future arrangements with regards to the intermodal competition. So it's essential, and because it's rolling on now, and because it's high on the agenda, that we need to keep up the role of the railways as it has been so far, or even strengthen it. I sincerely hope that it will also be possible to have such a mutual understanding in future as well. Customs and border crossing. What more to say than what has been said by the road colleagues? What more to be said, what had been discussed here previously with regards to the border between the UK, so means the Northern Ireland and Ireland. And Eurotunnel, obviously, that we'll be talking, a few minutes after. So, I can hardly add anything else than we need to continue running our businesses, both on the freight and the passenger side, without major disruptions. That will be disastrous for the economies, again, of both the future EU27 as well as the UK. Research and innovation. Again, we have something that we have been, and it took us ages to bring together the program which is called the Shift to Rail. And we have the unique one. We are pouring a lot of the money and resources and the efforts into it. So also in the future, with regards to the research focused on rail, we need to continue mutual contribution to both sides, the UK and the EU. And of course, we should allow our UK colleagues to be part of this process of the research with regards to the railways and the not only digitalization of the railways, but in the general more competitive railways with regards to the global competition. And finally, transitional agreements. If all what I said should apply, so that if all what I said that should be possible with regards to the disrupted services and building the really valid and through and genuine single European rail area, we need to have the transitional arrangement that will allow us to do so up until we have kind of a bilateral agreements that can apply on the land transportation, changing the rules, but nothing like creating a gap so between what we have today established as a regulation and what may potentially come in the future, which nobody of us is aware of. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lochman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lochman. And now I'll give the floor to Monsieur Gounon. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for giving time to look at the Channel Tunnel, which is, of course, a unique project. It was established by an international treaty more than 30 years ago now, and the innovation of that was to give a unique regulatory framework for the tunnel. So Brexit shall not put an end to that. There's no plan to change that regulatory framework. The Channel Tunnel is the longest underwater tunnel in the world. It's a motorway for rail because cars and lorries can be placed on trains going through the tunnel. And of course, the high-speed trains, Eurostar and freight trains also use that tunnel. It was opened in 1994. The Eurotunnel is a concession holder for the Eurotunnel. Its capital includes huge investments, and everybody is looking to see whether or not Brexit is going to affect the Channel Tunnel. So it's an important responsibility for the European Parliament as well to give specific attention to the issue of the Channel Tunnel. I may perhaps be contradicting what has been said about Ireland, but I would stress that the Channel Tunnel is a land border because you can go on foot from the continent to the UK. So Ireland is not the only country with a land border with the UK. Channel Tunnel does represent a land border. And more importantly, you can see on this slide that since the opening of the Channel Tunnel, there have been hundreds of millions of passengers, cars and lorries have used that tunnel. So it's really a vital link. And if I could just give you some figures from 2016 in terms of goods value, 116 billion euros worth of goods have transited through the tunnel in that year. That represents 25% of trade between the UK and the continent. And this involves trade with all the countries of continental Europe. It represents 62% of exports to the UK from those countries. And another important point with regard to the Brexit negotiations. If you jeopardize that major channel of trade with the UK, and as I say, it affects suppliers and manufacturers throughout Europe and passengers from throughout Europe, it's 62% of the market share. You're obviously, the one with the 62% of the market share is going to suffer more than the one that has the 32%. And I would draw the Parliament's attention to the danger of fallout from the Brexit negotiations on the Channel Tunnel. The consequences in terms of employment for the continent would be enormous. This is something that we don't talk about enough. I am glad that the Transport Committee has given me this opportunity to remind you of this very obvious fact. The bad impact of Brexit on the Channel Tunnel will affect the continent more than UK, possibly. Just in time technology is vital in the context of the tunnel. I mean, air transport is too expensive and can't handle the kind of volume of freight that goes through the tunnel. On an average day, you have 100,000 lorries going through the tunnel. They take up 20 meters of space. That means that in an average day, 100 kilometers of lorry trains are going through the tunnel. So you have 200 uninterrupted lorry trains going through the channel every day. So, you know, come and see for yourselves what this represents. Please do. It's fascinating. Come and see it with your own eyes, because you have to see it to believe it. So I'm saying this to explain that any kind of interruption, any disruption to that kind of fluid movement is going to cause a blockage that will paralyze Benelux, but also all of the supplier countries of goods that are exported to the UK. So this is going to be more of a problem to Europe than it is to the UK. So to absorb this very high level of daily traffic, you have to keep maximum fluidity. And it's a whole question of congestion which is at stake. We have this Franco-British border. Eurotunnel is prepared to accommodate any kind of customs facilities necessary to keep things going smoothly. We hope that ICT will make it possible for us to maintain fluidity. We don't want customs formalities to delay the fluidity of movement through the tunnel. It would have huge economic consequences, employment consequences, and environmental consequences. Imagine having dozens of kilometers of tailback of polluting lorries at the border. That's just impossible to contemplate, because of course intermodality and environment are key concerns for us. So the fixed cross-border cross-channel link is a land border, I think, and the most important one. It is subject to specific rules, and we have to maintain that specificity, otherwise it just won't work. We cannot change the regulations applying to the Channel Tunnel mid-route, halfway through the tunnel. This would cause potential disasters. I mean, there could be deaths, and this sort of thing is just not acceptable. We have to keep this notion of the juxtaposed frontier, rather than having the frontier in the middle of the tunnel. And we have to use all possible ICT facilities to ensure smooth customs processing. We have to ensure that customs clearance can be achieved as soon as possible, to allow the trucks and passengers to move quickly. I think it's a responsibility on all of us. And I urge the European Parliament to intervene and the Transport Committee to intervene to bring pressure to bear on the negotiators to say we are talking about 62% of the exports from Europe to the UK in your hands here. You cannot, as Europeans, allow yourselves to destroy this wonderful success story which has been ongoing for 30 years.
Monsieur Gounon, avec un mot d'ordre qui est très clair.
Thank you. The message in what you said was quite clear. Let's avoid destroying this project which has been built with so much shared European energy. A clear message which is clearly underpinned by very serious concerns. Thank you too for describing the potential consequences of the modal shift, the potential effect on jobs, and also the potential impact of changes in legislation. If we go back to the starting point, that would involve reviewing a whole raft of legislation. You also gave us some pretty impressive figures, 240,000 people working in the rail sector. What do we do? $41,000 Europeans who work for you. So what can we do? Do we have to revise the legislation in this field? Above all, you said that what you've set up over the years is working. Why break it if it's working so well? So I'd like now to open the debate. Markus Pieper, first of all, for 2 minutes. I won't need 2 minutes. I think the message we've just heard, the figures we've been given, was so clear that when it comes to locomotive driver licenses, noise regulations, the fourth railway package, I don't think that we should turn them into a problem, quite simply because part of the European Union is collapsing. Our responsibility as politicians is to ensure that we can make sure things work smoothly. At the same time, however, I think that you are exaggerating. The suggestion that Brexit could lead to the collapse of the legal framework for the tunnel and massive job losses, I think you're exaggerating, as I said. We shouldn't politicise the situation. We will have to find solutions. Both sides will have to show responsibility, both the British and the European Union, and we will, of course, negotiate on that basis. Thank you, Mr. Pieper. Mr. Hertog.
Vielen Dank auch von meiner Seite.
Thank you. I think the problems are similar and comparable to problems with road transport. One of the real problems facing us will, of course, be customs formalities and, of course, technical access conditions. We'll have to find solutions to those problems. If any of you have proposals as to how we can address and solve those problems, we'll be grateful for them. Otherwise, we will have to try and find solutions ourselves. Once again, I would refer to what I said beforehand. We will have to be negotiating an overall package with the British government. I find it regrettable that we haven't had any discussion this morning of the enormous time and effort which has gone into trans-European networks. We have a 10 corridor linking the UK with the European mainland, the North Sea Mediterranean corridor. And if you look at the various different links, you can see that from Calais up to Dover, London, Birmingham, right up to Edinburgh and Glasgow, with branches across to Felixstowe and Southampton. It would be tragic if that were to cease to exist, or for further expansion through to 2030 were to be blocked. A great deal of spending has already been earmarked for those transport links. Furthermore could be available, but that demonstrates once again that we have to find new ways forward. I would repeat, the British government has to make a move. We've done so much to prepare this in recent years. It's up to the British government to ensure that those plans can become reality. I think that's quite clear. Thank you, Mr. Artug. Ms. Foster.
Thank you very much. And again, very welcome information, I think, from the panellists to be in this forum, because very often, as we said, we will get bits of information on actually what you do when we meet you, but I think that it always needs to be in the public domain, just the emphasis on that. I certainly pick up on a comment by Mr. Ertug on the Trans-European Network, and in fact I had some meetings last week with those involved in all of that. I'm sure Mr. Ertug did as well. So it is very important to think that we keep this up the agenda, because it's vital for both sides, really, when we're looking across the channel as well. In terms of mutual recognition licences, of course, as you know, we've covered quite a number of these issues in the previous panel, and I echo that. And again, I haven't certainly heard any indication that that would not be the case, certainly from a sort of a UK side, as well as when we were looking at, as I said, at social rules and various things like that. If I can just come on to the Eurotunnel. I'm the sort of one of them in this committee who's a real sort of air transport person. That was my background. But I have to tell you that I love the Eurostar. So I'll certainly be doing everything I can to make sure that Eurostar continues as it should from the passenger point of view, certainly. I think it's a fabulous product. I know a lot of your staff from France and other countries. They actually live in London, and I do chat to them quite frequently. I'll be back on one tomorrow. And I think it's a terrific railway, and not least, of course, Margaret Thatcher, our former Prime Minister, the late Margaret Thatcher, was one of those, along with the French government, who really pushed for this project to link us together eventually. So we'll certainly have to take that into account, and certainly the point on the freight that's coming through the tunnel, where you can't obviously put certain freight on aircraft. It needs to be actually on the railways as well as on the ships, because that's hugely important too. So I think I'd just say thank you for raising these issues, and I think those of us who really want a good outcome to all of this, a smooth outcome, we are actually pushing this information forward all the time, and I would obviously recommend that you are in all levels of your own governments, etc., and I'm sure collectively the Transport Committee will make sure that we keep a real firm hand on all of this. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Foster. Monsieur Telniczka, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Mr. Lecce.
Chair, and thanks very much indeed for your presentations. I cannot resist by starting that we seem to give up a little bit on, let's say, what might be the quality of the relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit. We sort of take it for granted that, internal market is not an option, which honestly is not an option. I think that would take a lot of political courage to admit it. But somehow we are throwing out also the baby, the customs union. And I think that that is something that I think is still worthwhile reflecting and elaborating on. Because, yes, if we end up without that, there are still ways of maintaining to a certain extent the flow, minimizing the implications, but the difference is huge. Even if we introduce technology, even if we're going to do our best. And by the way, we will not avoid a certain degree of protectionism, which has always been there and will be there. So I think that this is maybe something that I would plead for, let's say, interaction between us and the businesses. Maybe it's a pity that when the debate on Brexit was starting before the referendum, that maybe businesses were a little bit not more vocal, but okay, that is, I know, always difficult, but I cannot resist to make that comment. But I think that we should not be still giving up between relative level, a low level of quality of relationship and the customs union. I think that there is still a lot to fight for. Mr. Wright, I really do appreciate not only the structure that you have introduced, which was then followed by others, but also the complex way of looking at it, when you also included in a very, I would say, business-like, but also European way, the question of the employees, the workers, and the people that do business. I mean, the numbers that you have referred to, I mean, of course, the status of these people afterwards. And I think that both parties recognize the relevance of this issue, but I think that it's somehow, sometimes, underestimated, at least I don't hear it, that there is a strong business economic dimension behind it for European and British businesses. So I do appreciate that you have made that point. So I would really have, I would not necessarily have a question, because I had the same question before and was not really answered, but still, what is the feedback that you are getting in your interactions with both political representations, both in London and in Europe? I mean, I understand that politically something is not viable, but I don't really understand why the questions of customs union plus minus is not really reflected. I mean, what is the feedback, what is the reaction that you are getting? Because for a person that is, semi-intelligent, it's difficult to understand it. I mean, I just don't get it. And of course, needless to say that we take on board very much what you say here. We are firmly behind it. For us, it's one of our primary preoccupations, but I'm afraid those people on both sides of the channel that are less maybe up to date and knowledgeable should be sitting here, and they are still is a dialogue sometimes of death. I regret to say so.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Telinska. Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Telichka. Mr. Kramer. First of all, thank you for the presentations. I'm very interested in the way this debate is taking place. We have agreements with third countries, Norway and Switzerland in particular. I would like to know a bit more about debate within your organisation. What's the British position? Are the British saying we're happy with who it is, we want to keep that? Or are they saying that it's too expensive, the Norwegians and the Swiss pay for being members of the single market? I'd like to know what the position of British members of your organisations actually is. My final point now. Have you given any thought to the fact that over the last 10 or 15 years not enough time was spent talking about the value added of the European Union? My impression over the last few decades is that the British have spent so much time complaining about the European Union that we shouldn't really be surprised by what happened. So I'd like to know whether there is any remorse about the way that Europe has been presented in the past.
Tourne vers mes intervenants.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Turning now to the panellists. If I could ask you to answer that first group of questions, the main theme of which seemed to be what is the position of the main components of your organisations as to what the impact of Brexit could be. As far as the nature of the agreement is concerned, you've called for a transitional agreement, but what's the state of play on that? And perhaps you could also address Mr. Titcher's question concerning the response of the world of politics to your demands. So clearly these questions are urgent. Ms. Wright, first of all, for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. I'll take a couple of the items that were raised. Just first on the corridors, the Thames corridors. We've welcomed some of the investment we've had on our corridors for the Felixstowe to Nuneaton route on rail, where 1 in 4 containers that come in from ports in Great Britain then makes its onward journey by rail, which has an important environmental impact. So we have welcomed that, and we are looking at options for how we remain committed to the rail freight corridor, the North Sea Mediterranean rail freight corridor as well, and that work is ongoing, and I'm happy to update the committee on where we end up with that. In terms of political feedback, we've had excellent engagement actually with the Department of Transport in the UK and the Department for Exiting the EU. We have an ongoing dialogue with them, and they've been very open to the suggestions and solutions that we've put forward. So I hope that gives some reassurance as well that rail is being taken account of, and some of the specifics we believe are going into the negotiations. Obviously, there's higher level negotiations and big issues, particularly in the phase 1 to sort out first, but we are getting positive feedback on our presentation. We have to focus very heavily on trying to find solutions. We believe that those get the best response, and it takes some time to work those up. So we are looking for solutions as to what life could look like outside the customs union, whether we need additional infrastructure, for example, whether there's a possibility for rail to provide inland customs clearance solutions so as to not cause disruption at the borders themselves. So we're committed to working on and finding those solutions.
Thank you very much. I will first try to answer the point of Mr. Pipe with regards to the recognition. I mean, we don't only talk about the recognition of the licenses, the certificates, and safety authorizations on the side of the UK. It's rather the other way around, because what we risk, and I have a good hope that the British government or the UK government will be recognizing the technology and the equipment that will be moving through the tunnel, especially to the UK. But we have the worries that nothing like that will be accepted right from the day one on the other side. And that will create a huge difficulty with regards to the safety certificates of the companies, with regards to the authorization of the vehicles, the driver's certificates. I mean, there we will have to be prepared. And I'm moving to the second point, which will be also addressed here, you know, whether we are in contact with the politicians. Of course, we work in contact with the team of Mr. Barnier. But what we hear is, let's be prepared for the cliff edge solution, option. So it means that nothing will happen. So prepare yourself for that, you know. You don't have a safety certificate, which will be considered a single one. Try to be prepared that you will have to have two of them. You know, that's the answer that we get, systematically, I have to say. So that's to the second part. With regards to the final point, the position of the UK members, I believe that is what Laura has expressed here, and we are really glad that we can work together. And what I expressed here is also publicly available on our website, that we have the common position what needs to be achieved. And I will be more than happy that we can really achieve that at the end of the day. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Gounon, c'est à vous.
Thank you. There are two overriding priorities for Eurotunnel: rail safety and fluid traffic flows. The Eurotunnel is the busiest rail tunnel in the world, between 400 and 500 trains a day. Each Eurostar can carry up to 900 people, that's 3 or 4 planes. And a truck train carries 230,000 tons of goods travelling at 140 kilometres an hour. This is why we would like to have seen the rules applying as far as Folkestone, so as to protect safety of goods and people travelling under the tunnel. When it comes to traffic flows, clearly a real factor here is the infrastructure at the border. We know now that up-to-date equipment can smooth the way we deal with passenger flows. We need new and highly efficient IT tools. It's inconceivable that custom checks between the UK and the European continent would take more time than customs clearance for a Chinese container arriving in a European port. Obviously, we're in ongoing contact with the authorities responsible for the tunnel on both the UK and French sides. And the common sense answer would be as follows. If we are to create effective IT tools, we need to know exactly what problem we'll be dealing with. In other words, the new customs regulation needs to be adopted as quickly as possible. And over and beyond the need for a transitional arrangement, which has been supported here, it's common sense once again. We're all aware of the difficulties inherent in creating gigantic new computer systems. Inevitably, there will be a period in which we need to adapt to change. We'll have to move towards a system based on automatic customs clearance. So once again, let me repeat, the Channel Tunnel is part of the EU's heritage, and we all have a duty to protect it. In the relatively near future, we could all imagine autonomous lorries driving onto trains under the Channel Tunnel. It's inconceivable back then that there'll be officials rubber stamping customs clearance documents. So I think people haven't yet realised that we have to move from theory to pragmatic practice as quickly and as smoothly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Gounon, for that clarification. I would like to open the floor for comments and questions once again. First of all, Mr. Barr for 1 minute. Thank you. I have two questions for Mr. Lochman. First of all, recognition and type approval of the cross-border specificities you've referred to. I would like to know whether on the British Party, whether you are in contact with specific government agencies, whether work is already underway, or whether a new phase of negotiations will be required. I'm familiar with the model we've adopted with Switzerland. I was involved in negotiations myself. That's my first question. My second question is for Mr. Gounon, in French now. Mr. Gounon, you just suggested that we might be endangering the existing system, and if we do that would be more problematic for Europe than for the UK. Perhaps you could explain exactly what you mean by that. In my view, that would be an effort to influence the negotiators, which I think would be very sensitive. Ms. Del Monte. Thank you. We've heard all about the risks of Brexit on the quality of services, as well as on the quality of investment for customs agencies in the light of great uncertainty in the future. So I'd like to ask you what you think we can do when it comes to dealing with these risks for investment both in services and the building of infrastructure. My second question, we've heard about budget cuts, and other colleagues have also referred to the potential impact of this on cross-border projects. I'd like to know whether the UK could not only be a future trade partner, but also an ongoing partner of such projects in the European Union. Thank you, Mr. Riquet. Thank you, Madam Chairman. A brief preliminary remark. The great wisdom of our British friends means that these issues of trade and people are quite different. Because the British aren't in the Schengen Agreement, passenger transport has always given rise to problems. I would also add that we haven't referred to coach transport, in fact, the conveyance of passengers by road, another aspect of the issue. I think that national agencies and the EU regulators should be able to reach agreement on the way in which rail haulage will be dealt with. I do have a question now. Given the different characteristics affecting road and rail transport, the physical nature of the transport, the way the systems are organised, and the nature of the operators in the rail sector, they tend to be large public operators, and differences in infrastructure. I would like to know whether it wouldn't actually be easier to reach agreement on the way in which the two systems on the continent and the UK operate. Don't you think that Brexit might actually confer a modal advantage in the UK to rail as opposed to road? I hope my question was clear, said the Speaker. My second question, now this pertains to Eurotunnel, Mr. Gounon. Why is it that Brexit threatens to undermine the legal status, the international status of the infrastructure, that's to say the tunnel itself? Thank you, Mr. Riquet. Werner Kuhn. Good morning, Werner.
Binnenmarkt und Zollunion gehören natürlich.
Obviously, the UK and the EU are inextricably tied together. And we've seen over the years that clearly the different parties want to promote their own domestic economies, but I think there's a very risk of us both shooting ourselves in the foot here. Thinking back to the fourth railway package, the UK has always been a pioneer in many ways. The UK for many, many years had separation of infrastructure and operators and the concept of free competition. I would like to know how things actually worked in practice. That will, of course, be an important point in the negotiations. So that's my first question. Mr. Kramer referred to something beforehand. He asked what systems could provide a model for cooperation between the UK and Europe. Norway, for example, or would we go for rail cooperation like with Switzerland? It's important to remember that the UK is, of course, a net contributor, 5.6 billion euros a year, although net and gross figures are a bit different. So we're talking about 98 or 100 euros per person. Figures for Norway are comparable. That's 78 euros per capita, and the Norwegians don't have a commissioner, members of the parliament, or any say in regulations. So in the light of these figures, what will the upshot be, do you think, of the talks? Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Kuhn. Madame Anderson, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. Ms. Anderson.
Well, in terms of the issues about the civil service, it's good that the civil servants are paying attention to transport, but I think we all know that at political level it isn't necessarily happening. So what plans do you have to escalate the issue so that the politicians in the context of the EU withdrawal bill are actually paying sufficient attention to transport? Fantastic to have the Channel Tunnel representative here. Entirely agree with Mrs Foster about this. Margaret Thatcher, I have to say, though, preferred a road tunnel idea than a rail tunnel, so let's not forget that. But in terms of the Channel Tunnel, since we've got you here, what's happening about the Deutsche Bahn services? Because Eurostar are wonderful, I think they're fantastic, but it would be good to have Deutsche Bahn being able to run trains through the Channel Tunnel. And secondly, for those of us who are the opposite of Eurosceptic, it is a bit disappointing that your corporate name has been changed from Eurotunnel to GetLink. So perhaps you could assure us that you're still as firmly pro-European in the widest sense as ever.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Anderson.
Thanks. Keith Taylor.
Thanks again, Chair. Yes, and thank you for your presentations. Very useful. I've got to direct my questions to Eurotunnel. Given that the customs union is only open to members of the EU, and given that the UK is withdrawing, that's going to have an impact on your freight transport, which must be very worrying. I'd like you to outline your predictions of the likely impact on passenger traffic both ways through the tunnel. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Kistela. Monsieur Wim.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor. Wim van der Kamp.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have three questions, if I may. The first of these is directed to Ms. Wright. You kindly wrote to me on the 13th of November 2017, and in your letter you wrote that 41,000 nationals of EU 27 member states work in the rail sector in the UK. So, practically speaking, what kind of problems could you face after Brexit? Work permits, residence permits, passports and so on. What kind of problems should we be anticipating? My second question now. This is for Mr. Lochman regarding the transitional period. When in our road haulage sector I raised the same question. What's your preference? Would you like existing rules to remain in place until Brexit becomes definitive? Something which I would add in brackets that I'm not sure is going to happen. Or would you expect what the speaker calls as in-between regulations, which could be far more complex? Perhaps you could comment on that. And turning now to the CEO of Eurotunnel. Is there a risk that border controls and surveillance and the fight against terrorism could be used as an argument to block the free flow of trade and persons? I'm not sure if the British are planning on doing this, but we need to be quite clear about it.
Mes chers collègues, merci beaucoup.
Thanks very much for those questions. Awful lot of issues were raised. And the 41,000 European citizens working in the sector in the UK, what's going to happen to them? Because we don't know at all, really, about what citizens' rights will be available, the transition period. How do you see the transition, if there is a transition period? Because if there isn't a transition period, then it's a very different issue. Mr. Gounon. I'm sure you'll be able to field that. What will the impact be? How would it change the actual status, or the statute, I beg your pardon, of Eurotunnel? And what have you come up with to anticipate Brexit? Because if we have a Brexit, as Theresa May has said, the UK could leave the European Union and leave the single market on the 29th of May at midnight. What will that mean for you? Those are just some of the questions. So if you could reply to them all in 3 minutes, that'd be really great. Okay, that's nice.
Thank you. I've picked up 6 points there, I think, that would be good for me to quickly rattle through. First of all, we want to remain a committed partner with the European Union Agency for Railways. We believe that Britain has had a valuable input to many of the processes and specifications that have come from the agency. Some of that will be subject to negotiations at the highest level regarding agency membership, but regardless of that, we would like to keep a strong partnership, whether directly as Rail Delivery Group or working with our partner CER. On the 41,000 EU27 nationals, in the rail industry in Britain, we pride ourselves as a high-quality employer, employing the brightest and the best, and we're creating 20,000 new high-level apprenticeships, for example, and 10,000 new jobs in the next decade and up to 2027. So it's important to have the brightest and the best available for those jobs. And whilst we don't know what the settlement will be on citizens' rights, and I couldn't sit here and predict that, we think there should be a clear, straightforward system for all levels of skill, because we're not just talking here about the very highly skilled engineers, for example, that we need to work on high-speed rail. We're also talking about colleagues with language skills and colleagues in the sort of the middle tier of skills, and also colleagues across the rail industry. So we want a simple, clear system in place. It's always great to hear GB Rail being described as a pioneer. In relation to the fourth railway package, we've seen a doubling in passenger numbers since liberalisation and strong growth in rail freight since this point, and high passenger satisfaction levels. And we would want to remain committed to some of the key components of the fourth railway package, and we've been very supportive, particularly of the work of this committee on that, and we don't foresee that changing as a result of Brexit. I would like to pick up Lucy Anderson's point on politicians. Yes, the civil servants have been excellent, and I really would like to thank them for their work, but yes, it relies on the politicians too. To assure you, we had a round table with ministers, both from DFT and DEXU, to raise the high-level issues. We also have meetings on an ongoing basis with them, so please be assured we're speaking at all levels and hoping that rail is heard in the debate. We're also working together with other parts of transport sector, which helps amplify our voice. As we heard this morning, we have so many issues in common with road, but also with aviation and the maritime sector. And then I think there was one last point, I think, to pick up here, which was around investment in rail. Yes, we have seen European funding going into rail in the UK and particularly in Great Britain, but we also have a huge domestic commitment to investing in infrastructure. It's hugely important. More than 50 billion will be invested in British railways in the next decade, and we have that commitment to put that financing in. So hopefully, I heard rail having a modal advantage. We'd love to see a greater shift from other modes to rail, again in line with the European aspirations.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lochman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lochman.
A few questions again back to the recognition and our negotiations with the UK. With regulatory entities or the UK government. This is what we rely here on the RDG to do so, together with Eurostar, obviously, and the other partners on the UK side, in order to have it in place in the right way, so that the recognition of the certified and authorized entities on the side of the EU27 will apply in the UK. So that's taken care of. I said that I'm more afraid, I'm more worried that it will not work like that on the other side, for which I hope, and now we'll come to the question of Mr. Riquet, that yes, we need to have something like the land transport agreement that will be covering all the land transportation modes, and that will be really comprehensive with regards to what we can expect from Brexit to happen. And in the meantime, the point of Mr. van der Kamp, for us the transitional period is really to keep the status quo with regards to the regulatory provisions as they are today, as long as we can, or even longer than even after the Brexit, so to say, because that will be the ideal situation that can be then transformed into something that we can call the land transport agreement between the EU and the UK. So that's what I can say to the points. There was one about what can be the future of the customs with regards to the new procedures. I mean, we are already now in a situation that we have to transform our processes, because we have to transfer the paper declarations towards the electronic ones. We have to adapt to what is called the NCTS. I mean, it's not the ETCS, but NCTS in this respect. So we have a lot of in front of us with regards to the adaptation of the system, which applies again on both sides. So in the continental Europe as well as on the side of the UK. If one day it will have to be used also at the border, let it use, but we should not have yet a third system. So that's why I call it, for us, for the railways, we have to work now on the NCTS, and we want to apply the NCTS for the railway in a universal manner and harmonized manner on both sides of the border. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lochman. Monsieur Gounon.
Thanks, Mr. Lochman. Mr. Gounon.
Oui, il a été dit, et c'est exact que la...
Thanks, Chairman. As was correctly said, UK's never been in Schengen, so there are some kind of checks. Buses, they travel on buses on these routes, and that can be sorted out quite well. But the future is interoperability for rail transport. If you want to go from Frankfurt to London on the Eurostar, interoperability is the only possible way. So that's can work properly in that way. So we need to keep that vision going, and we need to make sure that interoperability through a corridor goes all the way to the United Kingdom. The fact that we're going to have London-Amsterdam through Eurostar next spring is a positive step. It shows that even if it's not going to be in political Europe, it's still going to be in geographical Europe. And then trade, the tunnel with its user-friendliness has meant that economies have become interdependent. I tried to stress that before, and I gave you two examples. Pretty much all the cars made in the UK are made with parts made in Germany and through the just-in-time process sent through the tunnel. So there's thousands of jobs in Germany which will be affected by a lack of fluidity. Another example, going the other way, Scottish salmon, which we all eat. 95% of Scottish salmon goes through the tunnel to Boulogne, the first fishing port in Europe, to be sliced, smoked, packaged, etc. And it goes back sometimes to the UK through the tunnel. So economies always look for the best performing systems to meet the needs of their population. That's something which we should do. It's our duty to keep that kind of thing going. On a more general point, terrorism, raised by Mr. van der Kamp, obviously a very tragic issue, and it is a major concern for Eurotunnel. We work with the highest authorities of the states concerned. Experts and specialists are saying that when the tunnel was designed, you had the IRA basically blowing somewhere up about once a week, so the risk was factored in when the tunnel was being built. And we do have detection methods which are high-tech, and we have brought them in to allow us to focus and check freight trains, and we could always put up a scanner at the outside the tunnel to check a train fully before it even goes in. Finally, the tunnel, the Eurotunnel will remain Eurotunnel, the owner of the tunnel. 95% of the shares are owned in Europe, so we're not going to drop it. But it's the mother company that is quoted on the stock exchange. And 75% of the investors in the mother company of Eurotunnel are non-Europeans, third country people, the people from the United States, from China, from Asia, Australia. I was surprised to see that people often understand the aspects of the Channel Tunnel than some countries in Europe do. So to protect us from the possible negative aspects of Brexit, we had to, in inverted commas, protect the quoted company, but we are using the Tokex Channel Tunnel to have an electrical interconnection. ELEC link is what it's called. That's why you've got the Eurotunnel group on one side, ELEC link on the other. We want to continue to keep Europe linked to the United Kingdom, even after Brexit. Thank you. The Chair. Well, I think we really do. Our guest deserve a hearty round of applause.
À nos intervenants.
That was tremendously good stuff. Thanks very much for spending time with us this morning, and I can assure you that the doors of our committee will remain open to you. And we've started already on the Brexit debate, so there are going to be more, and we're very pleased to have you here. We can also say, just very briefly, is that there are